anything like the same extent. You know, so for example, if you think of Builder, the builders are still using pretty much the same technologies they've had for the last 30 years or so. I'm sure some of their tools are different and so on, but clearly, you know, all of these revolutions in computers, in internet and so on, it's totally irrelevant for them. That's not changing. That's really not changing their way of working in any significant way. Right, so a bit more of empirical evidence in favour of this sort of this theory is when we compare we look at the patterns of exports between countries such as the US and poor countries, in this case Bangladesh. And what the theory predicts is that if the US is relatively abundant in high-skilled industries, whereas Bangladesh is relatively abundant in low-skilled workers, then Bangladesh should tend to export to the US those low-skilled industries. And for example, textiles, as you know, is one of the greatest exports in Bangladesh. It obviously requires skill, but what we're saying is that you don't need many years of education. It's the manual work, and obviously there's lots of skill in there, but you can learn it over time, and it's very much learning by doing. So this is not really, don't see this, it's just terminology we use. We're not really saying that people that are doing these jobs are in any way inferior, of course not. What we're saying is that to be realistically, they just don't need to go to school for many years. It's a job that you learn by doing, and doesn't require many years of education. Yeah, but what we get, as you can see from this figure and the next ones, is indeed that the exports from Bangladesh into the US are mainly concentrated on low skilled sectors. So this is the so-called skill intensity of the industry. So for example, you can measure this as the percentage of the labour force in the industry that has X years of education. And what we're saying here is that most exports from Bangladesh to the US are requiring simply low skills. So no need to have a high educational attainment. But as you can see as well, this is not black and white. That is, we're not saying this doesn't suddenly stop. We're not saying Bangladesh cannot export any high skill good. That's not true, but it's the tendency. So it may well be that there are some firms in Bangladesh or in the southern countries that are able to do something amazingly well. So there's going to be a niche of firms that are still able to export. But what we're saying is that on average, they will not have people with that many people with high skills in many industries, and so they will tend to export the goods that use low skilled relatively intensively. Yeah, and exactly the opposite for Germany. Germany, of course, a country with endowments in terms of educational attainment very, very similar to the US, but also powerhouse in manufacturing, as you know, and this is reflected by the sort of export. So, does Germany export stuff that doesn't require huge skill intensity? It does, but most of its exports, look at this, are clearly in the high skill intensity industries. Yeah. Now, the next two diagrams or graphs are relevant because they show you, and this is something that I would really like you to take from the module, is that comparative advantage is not immutable. That is, it's not set in stone. You can change. And one of the things that I've been saying, of course, is that what lies behind this classification of low skill and high skill is effectively education. I mean, education is definitely going to allow you to use a lot more of your potential. And so with education, you're able to do a lot more things than without it. I mean, the obvious thing is, when you can't read, and there are still dozens of millions of people around the world that cannot read, there's only a certain number of things that you can do. You need to be able to read a piece that says 5 lines, here are the instructions. This is how you're going to operate this machine. If you can't read, then it's going to be tricky. Of course, you can be told what to do, but it's, the potential for things to go wrong and so on is much, much greater. So what we're saying here is that what lies behind this classification, low skill and high skill, is education. But all of you know, and many of you are studying economics of developing countries, and many others have done growth and development and globalization and development, you know that the accumulating human capital is about societies investing in the education of the population. So if you manage to move the average educational attainment of your population from, say, 3 years of schooling to 10 years of schooling over a few decades, and some countries have basically done that, the South Koreas, China, Japan and so on, then of course, even though 50 years ago it was impossible to think of exporting high-skilled goods, now it will become a possibility. And this is clearly shown by the change in the pattern of trade between Japan and the so-called Four Miracles, so Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and what's the other one? Singapore, between 1960 and the 1990s. So in the 1960s, those 4 countries that I was talking about, plus Japan, were obviously had much lower educational attainment than the US. So they would export stuff to the US, but it was concentrated in low skill. Fast forward 38 years, and this has changed very substantially. So Japan is now obviously exporting mostly high skilled goods, and even the four miracles are now exporting a much broader range of products. So this is a big message, of course, because this is saying, well, it does also make sense sometimes for politicians to say, I want to do what those guys do. That is, I know that the high values in producing cars, my country, let's say South Korea, 30 years ago, never used to produce cars, and now it is producing cars. So clearly, you can change things, but it's not obvious, and it requires an enormous amount of time. It really requires decades to be able to move the average educational attainment of a population very substantially upwards. Yeah, because of course, if you think about the logic, you only start with the young. So all of those people that have gone to school for 2 years or 3 years and they're age 20, they will have another 40 years working when they're not going to upgrade their educational attainment. So you really need, effectively, for all of those people that were illiterate or have very low educational attainment to leave the labour force before the average educational attainment increases very, very substantially. So it's an investment of decades rather than a few years. And of course, the problem with these things, of investments of decades, especially in democracies, is that you really require several governments to be to have effectively the same sort of policy. So if you have one government that says, let's spend a lot on education, then the next one says, well, no, we have lots of other things that we need to do, then that's not going to, the educational attainment is not going to increase very quickly. Yeah? Right, so beyond the basic Heckscher-Ohlin model, so this is not going to be, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This is, what I'm doing here is helping you a bit with the extra reading. So as always, we only have time to introduce the basic stuff. There's some of the things that are super obvious and you read them and that's it. And other things might be less obvious. So what I'm doing here is just to alert you to some of the extensions of basic Heckscher-Ohlin theory that are very useful to explain the real world. So this 2x2 version came up with these sharp predictions. In particular, the prediction about factor price equalization is very, very strong. You know, trade does the same that migration would do if there were free movement of people. But of course, we derive this making strong assumptions, and these should go without saying. Transportation costs matter. So if you're sending grain from Australia, travels tens of thousands of miles, of course you cannot sell it for the same price as in there, because you need to add the cost of transportation. There is no free trade out there, so trade barriers, as you will see in the last topic, have been reducing very substantially in the last few decades, but there's still plenty of goods and services for which the barriers are high, and it varies a lot from one country to another. And of course, there are plenty of goods, and in particular services, which are not traded. So all of us do stuff every single day that really cannot be traded. So whenever we go and have lunch, whenever we buy coffee, whenever we get a haircut, whenever we go to the cinema, whenever we go to a theatre, all of that, to concerts, all of that are services, and we spend, as you know, more than 60% of our income on services. Those services cannot be traded. Having said that, the extent to which the services can be traded internationally does change with technology. And for example, the internet has made lots of things that services that used to be only done domestically now subject to international competition. So there are, for example, lawyer services, accounting services. That stuff can now be actually done abroad and exported or imported, depending on the perspective. Yeah, but this means, of course, that because you have all of these products and services, and many of them will not be subject to international competition, there is no reason why you would expect, even with free trade, for all prices to be equalised. Yeah, so it's still the case, of course, that if you get a haircut in this country, you pay literally 10 times, 20 times more than if you were in a very poor country in Africa or Asia. Yeah, because you can't simply go there. You're going to get a haircut. It will be extremely expensive to go to the other country to get the cheap haircut. Okay, so we should not expect equality of prices. Now, the other thing that I'm sure all of you know, I mean, I cannot say how much you remember from your second year macro, but I'm sure you remember this idea that the reason why our standards of living are so much higher is basically twofold. One is because most people have a lot more capital to work with than in the poor countries, so they have a lot more human capital, and they have a lot more physical capital as well. And the second thing is that we are using ways of doing things, effectively technologies that are substantially more advanced. So we started off this topic by saying, let's rule out productivity differences. Let's rule out the thing that explains comparative advantage using Ricardian trade theory by assuming that the two countries, or home and foreign, have access to the same technologies. And let's explain trade only due to differences in relative endowments. But of course, that was a very strong assumption, and realistically, if you want to talk about north-south, say, you need to allow for different technologies. Yeah? And so, once you allow for different technologies, then the predictions that you get are a lot more plausible. And so, I'm not going to go over these slides. So as I say, these are just details to allow you to understand that passage in your readings that says, don't forget that technologies may differ substantially. But the basic prediction is that what you're going to equalise is no longer the wage per worker, but it's the wage per unit of effective worker. And remember, this is the wage you get, the wage paid divided by A, that index of productivity. So I'm just giving you an example of how this is done. So this is labour augmented technical progress. For those of you that did intermediate background, this is the vast majority